How you doing, Kenton? What's up? This is episode 2 of Locked on Nordren.
Episode take two, episode two, take two.
Episode 2, take 2. That is correct. After some audio issues because of Dominican electricity problems, we are once again going to record a podcast talking about the four pillars of Souls-like games. On the last take of this episode, we came to a conclusion on what the four pillars of Souls like games are because the community, which I follow closely, I listen to a lot of the content creators for the Souls community, the Soulsborne community, guys like Last Protagonist, guys like Iron Pineapple, guys like Inferno Plus. When he was active, he's not active anymore. Obviously, Body Vidya, and there are a lot of loose definitions on what a Souls-like game actually is. For example, Iron Pineapple, which has a series, who has a series talking about a bunch of unknown or lesser-known Souls-like games, really stretches the definition of what a Souls-like actually is. So we're going to be talking about what we consider to be the four true pillars of a Souls-like game. What do you think about that, Kenton?
Well, I think it's important to get a good definition down for when we want to revisit this in the future. Maybe update this as needed.
Yeah, first off, we talked about the punishing combat in the games. And when we talk about the punishing combat, we talk about organically difficult combat based on positioning and based on strategy. And we had a very, let's say, productive discussion about the fact that some games, not necessarily Souls like, but some games use some mechanics to create artificial difficulty for their combat. Remember, we were talking about Uncharted Force Online and how to roadblock you from, completing the entirety of the online wave missions. They will make enemies so bullet spongy. There's no changes to the AI, the AI. There's no changes to the gameplay loop. There's no changes to strategy. It's just that enemies get like they become damage sponges, just like they do in the division.
I think the real issue we had with that game though is we would have gotten a hell of a lot further. We only picked it up the one night. We just started cranking through levels. But they added this other mechanic where you get these passive buffs. Per level that you get a certain percentage of damage reduction or attack advantage, and you only get these buffs once you go up levels, separate experience levels, not levels within the game. So you can get up to level 50, but you've only gone maybe 7 or 8 levels, and you don't stand a chance. All these enemies are still bullet sponges, so it's almost like they're hardwalling you from going that high unless you go back to the beginning of the whole level, the whole series, and try to work your way back up.
So it's really there's no strategy involved. Again, it's a shooter, but when we're talking about the punishing combat of the Souls-like series, some there's always or not actually not some there's always a lot of focus on your defensive capabilities. There's usually a roll or a jump or some sort of movement option that you have that has some iframes in them that are your basic defensive option. Either that or being able to block most or all of your damage at the with the exchange for either stamina or the ability to block only so many hits before your guard is broken, and then you receive massive damage from a follow-up attack. But the main point when we talk about the punishing combat in the Soul series is that the difficulty on the combat is organic. And as you master the system, it becomes more and more possible to be able to handle whatever the game throws at you, no matter the challenge that you're imposing even to yourself. You can finish a Souls game at the beginning level and without upgrading a weapon with enough mastery of the system. Because, again, The combat is based on strategy and positioning.
So
Now,
when you talk about an organic difficulty, do you mean that it's like they just have these health bar sliders or attack bar sliders for these enemies or these bosses, or is it they have they're hard coded for the level that they think you will be once you get to that particular enemy or that boss?
no, mostly what I mean is when I say organic difficulty is that in Souls games, when you die, you're supposed to feel that you died because of a mistake you made. It doesn't feel cheap, like you died because the enemy is a bullet sponge, or in this case an arrow sponge, or a sword or slash sponge that you can't kill, and there's no strategy that you can employ because you're just not supposed to be able to beat it right now. So organic difficulty, in this case, in this instance, is talking about difficulty levels based on the fact that in order to overcome this obstacle, it must be overcome through the use of knowledge of the game and not trying to brute force it, is what I'm trying to say. So it always feels like when you die, well, I died because I rushed, I died because I pulled two enemies at once, I died because I didn't block an attack I should have blocked, or I died because I let myself get poisoned. So it's always, in a sense, like basically your fault as a player, and you can't blame the game. Well, this game is BS because it did that. Seven guys threw a grenade at me at the same time. That's what I mean by organic difficulty.
Interesting. And so when we move on to kind of a risk reward type of gameplay, that the Souls like games usually have that front and center when they make their games. Is that right?
Yeah, and again, we're talking about death, and when we're talking about the risk reward aspect of it, we're talking about the fact that in Souls games, death means something. It's not like most modern games where you die and you go back to a checkpoint. That's not it. Like you have currency, or you have some sort of experience points, or you have money that you lose when you die. When we talk about the Soulsborne, if we're excluding Sekiro, the Souls system are and blood echoes in Bloodborne. Those are your currency for upgrading your weapons, purchasing items and armor, and leveling up your character. So it is a hard penalty to die and lose all of your souls. Then you have to get back to the point where you died to get back all of those souls. But if you die again, all of those souls are overwritten. So again, exploration does have a lot of risk reward to it, because if you're exploring and of you run out of healing, or you're not sure that you're going to be able to kill a certain enemy, then what do? And here comes the risk reward aspect. If you continue, you may be able to find a bonfire or a rest point, a lamp in the case of Bloodborne, and keep all of those souls. But if you die, you may not be able to make it back to that place because you don't really know the area that well, or it's just you've been playing for a while, and maybe you'd be better off going back using an item to go back to the previous save point and improve your weapon or your stats and then continue. So that's something that's always in the back of your mind, and it creates a sense of do we call it dread? A bit of dread, like I can't die here. I don't want to die here. I need to go back, and that creates suspense, and that actually adds to the gameplay. What do you think about that, Kenton?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an aspect of Souls likes that you have to constantly take that trade off of progress versus what you've gained already. So for everyone else, that line may be different for everyone else. So it really depends on how you want to play the game.
And the beauty of it is that takes us straight to the third pillar of the Souls games. That is essentially the base. The games are based mostly on exploration and resource management. And we were talking about the risk reward aspect of exploration itself. When you've run out of healing, do you use that divine blessing that's in Dark Souls 3? That's a extremely rare item that is going to completely increase your health because you think that you may make it to the next bonfire, or do you save that for a top boss fight, maybe in the DLC, knowing that you can go back right now to a save point and use the souls that you've accrued. And also, resources in this game, especially in the beginning, are limited. So you want to explore as much as possible to gather as many resources, and both resources to use as, for example, in the offensive sense, and resources to use to improve your equipment as you can. You can't just shotgun through the game without looking for anything unless you're a speedrunner with great knowledge of the game and the positioning of the items, because you're going to need all of these items to improve your character, to improve your weapons and armor, and in general, in order to be able to buy other resources. Because as you know, you find these items that give you souls, and if you die and you lose a bunch of souls and you need to buy some resources, that's the only way to gain souls without farming. So
That's
again,
really the only way you're gonna lose progress is if you lose souls.
yeah, that's part of that's part of it. Like, you're heavily encouraged to explore, but you're also heavily encouraged to explore carefully, because if you die and you lose your souls, that's going to set you back significantly, especially if you have greatly explored an area before you died.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter if you've gone through the entire level, the entire area. All those enemies are going to respawn, or at least most of them, before you get to or beat a boss. But if you keep constantly dying to some of the more major mobs that are hanging around, and you keep losing your soul, that's really the only way you get stuck in an area.
And regarding exploration, that's something we actually forgot to mention in the first take of uh, of this episode of the podcast, that the enemy respawn mechanic is a part of the risk reward aspect of exploration, and also the resource management aspect of exploration, because every time you use a bonfire, then all the enemies respawn. So then you also have to think, well, I may want to push through, because if not, I'm gonna have to beat all these enemies. But the enterprising player may think, well, I'll just go back to the bonfire, kill all these enemies again, and get even more souls that I can use to upgrade my character. So it also makes you feel a bit more in control of your progress in the game as far as exploration goes, because again, the exploration mechanic of the game, the essentially encompasses two of the four pillars of the game itself. One in the risk reward, and one in the resource management. And the way, like, how daring are you? How much of a risk take are you? Essentially, can decide the type of experience that you get out of these games. Like, nobody experiences, and that's part of the video of the core mechanics, that nobody experiences the Soulsborne games in the same way, in my opinion.
No, I do think that's true because everybody does have that different amount of risk that they want to take, just like everybody does in life with other things as well. Um, Also, I'd like to try and get, since we're talking a bit of a circle here, let's get on to like how we might progress our characters instead of just through a level.
Yeah, that is also a great point. Character customization and progression is also important for for the Soulsborne series, and Souls like games. And it's the fact that great you have a great amount of control over the way your character progresses, be it by stats, and it's like that in all of the Soulsborne games, and also by improving your weapons, learning new spells, and those are all things that control the way your character plays. Now, the beauty of this is that there's no set progression, and there's no set character that you're going to play in any of these games. What does that mean? Well, I can play a guy with a huge two-handed sword that just smashes through everything and can tank some hits and has a lot of stamina, or I can play a squishy mage that does ton of magic damage and just dodges around with light armor. Like, you decide the way you want to play the game. A great example of this, Kenton and I are kind of different players, and you can see it if you ever see us online. You'll notice that Kenton is always going to have probably a huge sword or a huge axe, and I'm going to be running around throwing pyromancies or magic, because I'm more of a ranged kind of guy, and the game gives you the ability to play the way you want to play. Like if you want to be a squishy mage, or if you want to be a swordsman mage hybrid, you can do it. If you want to have a huge sword and a huge shield, you can do it. If you want a two-handed sword and basically dodge around, which is Kenta's play style, you can do that too.
There's not much more satisfactory than killing somebody with a giant club.
We both like the club, but my favorite character so far, at least as Dark Souls 1 and 3 pertains, is the Pyromancer. I had a Pyromancer as a first build in both games, and let me tell you, you finish the game as a Pyromancer, and then you go back and you play the game with a two-handed sword, and it's like an entirely different game. And again, the character progression system gives this line of games so much depth because every time you play the game with a different build, it's the same game, but it just feels different.
Also, I'd like to point out that with each if individual build, your risk reward might change a little bit. Those levels there.
Yeah, because usually mages can be seen as easy mode towards the middle and end of the game, but they're really hard to play at the beginning because they're squishy. Magic doesn't deal a lot of damage, but they're usually walking nukes by the end of the game. However, if you use a sword and shield guy, that's usually like I'm not gonna call it like the noob, but it's easier because he has more options, both defensively and offensively. And if you play a huge two-hand sword guy without a shield, that's a more difficult proposition. First off, because it's gonna take you some time to get the weapon that you want, and second off, because you're limiting your defensive options. So your mileage may vary for each character, but in the end, and this is another beautiful thing about character progression in Dark Souls, is that you begin feeling like a scrub, but you end up feeling like a beast. You feel the progression of your character, like the weightiness of the combat. That is also we didn't really mention it, but we're again the combat in all of the Soulsborne games, including Bloodborne, feels weighty, but it feels more weighty and more powerful as your character progresses.
True that. True that. I'd also like to just point out there are some good two-handed options early in Dark Souls 3. You get the giant club and the barren forest right there. So is
Yeah,
what it is.
but usually, unless you're prepared a build for that specifically, you're probably not gonna be able to use the giant club until a bit further in the game. And remember, by this point, you've had to optimize your build and sacrifice other stats in order to increase your strength, in
Yeah,
order to be
just
able to
strength,
effectively.
strength for days.
Yeah, I think
Early and
like
often.
two handing would give you 50% more strength, so you'd probably need around 19 strength in order to be able to double wield or two-hand wield the club.
That was 28.
And yeah, because it's 28 strength. And now that we've talked about the what we consider the four pillars of the Soulsborne series of games, I would like to give an honest review on a couple of games that are considered essentially Souls-like games, and I consider to be Souls-like games as well, and two games that the community generally considers Souls-like games that I don't really consider to be Souls-like games. And for starters, like we did last time, we're going to look at Sultan Sanctuary. Sultan Sanctuary hits on every level. If you look at it initially and you see that it's a 2D game, you're going to be like, there's no way that this is, the complete Souls like experience, but it really is. It has really punishing combat based on positioning and strategy. You can't just go shotgunning through everything. You need to learn enemy patterns. You need to learn when to jump, when to dodge, when to parry. And also, combat does have a weighty feel to it if you use some of the heavier weapons. And you have a lot of offensive and defensive options that only increase and expand as the game progresses. I'd say that I'm not gonna say outright is its own spin on the formula, but it does have the weightiness of the Souls combat with certain other let's say certain other offensive options that maybe the soul games don't present you with. And as far as the risk reward aspect, in Soul Sanctuary, you have both gold and you have a sort of soul system, and both are punished. Are very both punish you if you die. Like you lose a percentage of your gold, and of course all of the souls that you currently have that you need to pick back up. So also it has limited healing, and it has a more of a verticality to its exploration, which makes it even more dangerous. This means that there are a lot of more holes to fall into. There are some blind jumps, which I don't appreciate, but they are few and far between.
You wouldn't
Which
appreciate that given your prowess with jumping in most games.
I am pretty good at jumping in Sultan Sanctuary. Thank you very much, sir. Thank
Oh,
you
that
very much, sir.
doesn't really carry over to anything else.
Well, I did. I finished Sultan Sanctuary, and most of my deaths were not because of jumping. Let me tell you that. Most of my deaths were to bosses. And again, there's a lot of verticality in this game, but just like in the Soul series, you have to be very careful when exploring. You need to gather resources. You need to gather resources because you need to improve your weapons, because you want to find better gear, because you want to find items that will give you souls in order to level up, because you want to find the items to help you improve your creed. Creed is a system that is very similar to covenants in Dark Souls, but it's a bit more fleshed out. And in general, the exploration hits in every mark as it pertains to both resource management and risk reward. And when we're talking about character progression, also, you have essentially a grid where you can learn a bunch of both upgrades and techniques and magic for your character. So it's similar to Dark Souls because you progress your character and you have to plan out a build in the same way, but it's just done in a different way. Again, Sultan Sanctuary, in my opinion, some people will say the Neo series of games, but I don't agree with that. I think the ultimate Souls-like experience is actually Sultan Sanctuary. I think it's the game that carries on with the Souls-like experience with the most, let's call it, finesse without being an outright copy, while still being its own thing, but feeling very similar to a Soulsborne. So again, a Souls-like instead of being a faithful copy, which takes us to game number two of the games that are Souls likes, but in this case, we're going to talk about a Souls like not done well. And remember, we also talked about this game in the first take of the podcast, which is Lords of the Fallen. Lords of the Fallen was a decent game, but it took the weightiness of the combat way too seriously, to the point where your character feels all the time like when you're over encumbered in Dark Souls. It's very heavy. The roll is slow. Walking speed is slow. Yet your run is how can I say this? Out of placely fast. You run way too fast for how heavy your character feels, and the exploration in general is fine, but the places are uninspired. The risk reward is there. If you die, you lose all your souls. You have to go back and get them, and there's actually a timer implemented, which increases the urgency to go back and get your souls. But the difficulty of in some of the places you're exploring does not feel organic. It feels more forced with some of the normal enemies and even on the bosses. And nothing pisses me off more in a game than difficulty spikes. We touched on this. One of like the second or third boss in the game has an instant death attack that you have to figure out that you have to hide in crypts in order to avoid it. That is not organic, neither in the linear exploration sense of the game because you're not expecting this at all, or in the combat sense of the game. Resource gathering is fine, but you're very limited in the type of in the number of weapons and types of weapons you can use, and the armor you can't like there aren't as many options of armor, even though they give you some benefits for using whole sets of armor. And when we're talking about the character creation, you're also very limited. You're limited to a type. You're either a heavy weapon user, a magic user, or like well, actually, there are two types of heavy weapon users. One that does not use a shield, one that does use a shield, and a rogue type character, and also three categories of magic, and that's it. So it doesn't feel like you're as in control of your character as you are in Dark Souls. I'd say that this is a not a Souls like, but rather a Souls copy, and it's not that it's a bad game. I'd recommend people go through it at least once, but it just feels like all of the all of the four pillars of the Souls games done in a mediocre manner. What do you think about that, Kenton? A game that's mediocre in every aspect of the Souls like experience.
Yeah, well, Lords of the Fallen didn't really just rub off on me really all that well. So I think a lot of what people like about Souls likes is sometimes there's the multiplayer aspect to it that's kind of built into the lore of the game, like with the soapstones and the invasions and whatnot. And it keeps you grounded in the game and not having to jump out of into menus and be like, okay, I've got to play co-op and I got to go over here get the chat going. No, it's all right there in the game. You never have to leave the screen. So we've talked about what makes a good Souls-like game, what makes kind of a mediocre. So you've obviously looked at a couple of Souls-like lists in preparation for this video. What's a game that you saw on there quite a few times that you wouldn't consider a Souls-like?
Well, people talk a lot, first of all, about Blasphemous, which is a game I really enjoyed. But Blasphemous has a very simplistic combat loop. You're given your sword, which has one attack, and um some special attacks. What I mean by one attack is your sword that has one attack pattern, and you're given some skills that you can use. But other than that, it does require some positioning. It gives you the ability to parry and a dodge roll, but it doesn't feel as weighty as many of the Souls games, and it has a lot to do with your lack. Well, not as many as all of the Souls games, and it has to do with your lack of options, of offensive options. You're also given some magic, like you're given a character, and that's the character you use. So the combat loop, I don't think it's as satisfying as Dark Souls. I also don't think it's as difficult, and the difficulty of the combat isn't as organic, but rather it's a bit cheaper in terms of difficulty, but it's still a very fun combat, but in a different way. It does have a very good exploration loop with a lot of verticality, kind of like when I was talking about Souls and Sanctuary, but it's more of a Metroidvania type thing where even though the risk reward aspect is there because you die and you lose MP the more you die, first off, this is easily reversible through the use of a certain NPC, but also you're not as encouraged to explore for the following reason. I think that you do need to explore a little bit to improve your health and find some magic and things like that. But you can very well get through the game without looking for most of these upgrades. You don't have the urgency that you have in Dark Souls, even though it's a very difficult game. I think the map is well laid out. I like the map, but it just doesn't have that Dark Souls feel of you being so interested every time you get to a new place to explore the entirety of this. And this is something that actually Salt and Sanctuary does very well, even though it's also a 2D game. The point is that I think Blasphemous was looking, and again, before I move on, actually, let's talk about character progression. There's not that much character progression. You can increase your HP, your MP. You can find a couple relics that you need to traverse some areas. So again, it's more Metroidvania, and you also get some power ups for your sword. Your sword becomes stronger, but that's about it. So again, I don't think Blasphemous was going for the Souls like. I think it was going more on the looking for an organically difficult gameplay loop without it being frustrating. Even though Blasphemous is very frustrating in the beginning until you get used to the controls, which aren't as tight as I would like. But in general, I would say even though it's not a Souls like, it has a Souls like aspect to it, and it's a very enjoyable playthrough. But I don't think it's fair to call it as a Souls like outright.
Very interesting. Well, I think we basically covered everything we wanted to. Did you want to try and wrap it up, or do you have a few more things you want to touch on?
No, I'd like to wrap it up by saying that I think it would be a good idea for the community to come together on a definition of what a Souls like actually is. You're gonna play what you like to play, but it's cool to tighten the community regarding what Souls like games actually are, and maybe furthering the community's knowledge of these Souls like games so that they are played a little bit more. I was actually gonna touch upon Remnant from the Ashes. We did in the first iteration of this podcast. It's a good game, but again, it's not a Souls like outright. But it's one of the games that I think people should get to know a little better, and that's mostly the reason why we're doing this definition. Like, hey, this is Souls like. This isn't a Souls like. If you're coming into the community looking to play Souls like, maybe don't try this one that much, so you don't end up feeling disappointed. And also, this is going to be the backbone of some of the games we're going to be looking at in future podcasts. So you already know why we choose any game and actually call it a Souls like when you're going through it.
I think we can wrap it up right here. Stay locked on, Lordran.
Yeah, this were Kenton and Rafa. This is episode 2 of Locked on Log Drive.